But the main thing is he's got to prove to Megan that he's taking her concerns seriously and he is going to get therapy. Because remember, she said he had some outrageous anger issues and he had better figure out a way to deal with that. And he had to find a new therapist. So he found one. And he feels like some of his anger is stemming from pain. Pain that he was never able to deal with at the death of his mother, and pain that no one took seriously. So he says that he gets to this little office. It was about 30 minutes away from Notcott. It's a small room, and he likes the girl immediately, who is his therapist. She's about 15 years older than him. But what he really likes about her is that she reminds him of Tiggy. Now, we remember Tiggy. She had been his nanny when he had been younger. And she'd taken care of him for years. She'd been the nanny before his mother died. And then she'd sort of become, I don't know about a surrogate mother, but maybe a little bit. He had a lot of confusing feelings about Tiggy. If you don't remember, he didn't talk a lot about her, but in the very beginning of the book, in part 1, when he's talking about his youth or what he remembers of his youth, mostly starting around when Mummy died, he makes some comments about Tiggy that are almost sexual. So I think it's very interesting that he would now say that his therapist reminded him of Tiggy, because I think he doesn't say it outright, but he seems to sexualize or have weird mental relationships with women who are helping him get through things. And so anybody who sort of shepherds him in a sort of maternal role, he seems to attach some emotional feelings that are not typical for most men. Anyway, he makes the point to us that she reminds him of Tiggy, and he'd already told us how he felt about Tiggy, so I find it odd that he'd mention that to us, but whatever. He said immediately he starts sweating up a storm, because you know how he's got his sweating problems, and she nicely goes and brings him a fan and like points it right at him. So he's sitting there on the little green couch and he's all kind of nervous and he doesn't really know what to say. And so they decide to start at the most obvious point, Mummy's death, because clearly that's the thing that's bothered him his whole life. He says a lot of things that I find to be very interesting that I don't feel like he came to the conclusion of on his own. But in this text, he says that he presented certain feelings to the therapist, which I thought were completely understandable. Yet she sits there and keeps looking at him like, what? He's never wanted to talk about Mummy's death because he feels like if he does and he gets rid of some of this pain, the pain is all he has. He admits openly at this point, I don't remember her. I don't remember her face. I don't remember her laugh. I don't remember anything. And William had told me to go and look into some photo albums and maybe that would help jog my memory. He's like, it didn't work. So now all I've got is the pain. And I just don't want to give that up. And I'm afraid to come to therapy, and I'm afraid for them to help me get over that, because if I get over that, I have nothing. That makes total and perfect sense. And I don't understand why the therapist continues to look at him like, that's out in left field. Who'd ever feel that way? That makes sense to me. I get that. Anyway, so he keeps trying to explain. It's like a long thing where he keeps saying the same thing and she keeps staring at him. And he keeps saying the same thing and she keeps staring at him. I'm like, all right, we could have edited this a bit. At the end of this long and meaningless conversation, they finally get to the part, they finally dig down into what he really wants, something practical she can help him with. And he says, ultimately, what I want is to be able to cry, like really cry. I just need you to help me access my emotions because I seem like I can't do it. Now, for those of us reading the book, we're like, yeah, but Cress helped you cry and you kicked her to the curb. So I don't know if this therapist knows what she's getting into, but he claims that's what he wants because there's this heaviness in his chest, he says. The heaviness, he can't, he needs help excavating the heaviness. So she's going to help him get rid of the heaviness and help him to cry. Okay. That's session 1. Then we go into session 2. Session 2, he says, could he lie down on the couch and tell her all his problems? Wondering when you were going to ask. So we have everything about this book is so stereotypical. Then I went to my psychiatrist and laid down on the couch. It's like, I don't know who wrote this book, but it's somebody who didn't live real life, but watched others live it and thinks, oh, I think that's what I'm supposed to say at this part. Anyway, he lays down on the couch of the psychiatrist, therapist, whatever she is. And he writes that he tells her about Cress and about the skiing holiday and how all the emotions had sort of fizzed up and he'd finally been able to cry, but just a little bit. I mean, it hadn't been like the sob fest he had been hoping that it would be, you know. He really wanted a weep-a-thon is what he wanted, and he didn't get it. And he says that he had switched sadness for rage. In his opinion, that's what had happened here. So because he couldn't cry, he just got angry all the time. And he describes the scene in the kitchen with Meg. Well, it literally just says that he told his therapist, I described the scene with Meg. I wish he would have described it to us so we could have figured out what in the world happened there, but he doesn't. He vents about Pa and Willie. Again, like, I'm not skimming over this and not giving you guys the details. He, like, literally doesn't say anything. He just says that I told her about this. I said about Pa and Camilla. But this is what I find wild. Okay, so he's saying about how he's talking all about the family and, like, venting. But he writes this. I frequently stop myself mid-sentence at the sound of passers-by outside the window. If they ever knew! Prince Harry in there yapping about his family, his problems. Oh, the papers would have a field day. Or you could just write about it in a whole book. Like, what is he... Does he understand what he's saying here? There I was, just yapping on and on about my family, and I just was terrified anyone would hear. Then I doubled back home and wrote it all down in a book. Okay. Truly, truly, truly. His stupidity knows no bounds. Okay, so that which led them around to the subject of the press. So he tells her, oh my goodness, what if somebody heard what I was saying? You know, can they hear outside? And so that gets him onto this object of the press, which if for him is firmer ground. He definitely knows how he feels about the press. He just lets fly. He goes on and on and on about how disappointed he is in his countrymen and how they showed such contempt and they're so vile to the woman that he loves. And he says that, you know, the press had always been cruel to him, but he hadn't thought that they would extend that scourging whip to the back of the woman he loved. And here she was, just this poor innocent from America. And how dare his country treat her in this way? Then he says this, and do you remember, I don't know if you remember from last episode, I said that now that we've gotten to this section with Meg, there's a whole lot of, let me set the record straight, but act like I'm telling you the story. Right? So there's a lot that does not feel organic about this section because it's very much them answering back to things that they heard in the press for years. And now this is their time to, like, manipulate the story so that they can address certain issues. And this is one of them. He says he told his therapist, he said that he couldn't ever tell people how he felt because privately or publicly, people just rolled their eyes. They said I was whinging. Said I only pretended to want privacy. Said Meg was pretending as well. Oh, she's getting chased, is she? Well, give us a break. She'll be fine. She's an actress. She's used to the paps. In fact, she wants them. But no one wanted this. Like literally what we've all been saying. Hey, South Park. You know, it's like they don't want their privacy. They don't. Why don't they just own it? That's the thing that's so crazy to me. I think the thing that's bonkers to me is how dumb they think we are. Like, they think that we're just gonna, like, you know, we're in this collective trance where none of us remember that she wasn't very popular on Suits, where none of us are gonna remember that there weren't any tabloids about them, where none of us are gonna recall that we loved them at a certain point. Like, they think they can just lie to us like this? Maybe you can find one joker who'd lived his whole life under a rock and persuade him of this, but you cannot tell all of America and all of the Commonwealth and all of Britain. Remember, you hated us and you always have. It's like, no, we didn't. Anyway, he claims that it just hurt him that everyone would say that Meg loved it because, you know, she didn't. And, you know, the attacks she was getting were leading to her having panic attacks. In fact, he claims that one time she had even gotten a text from a perfect stranger telling her that he was going to put a bullet in her head. Who among us believes that? Who would do that? What? You're going to tell me, okay, Meghan has spent her entire life telling us a story about how she saved the Western world and women across the globe from dishwater hands because she said not all women have to wash the dishes, and she changed the face of dishwashing campaigns at the tender age of 11. You're going to tell me a person who can't stop telling that story would, for the first time in forever, we finally hear that, oh, by the way, one time somebody out of the blue texted her and said they were going to shoot her in the head. You know what I'm saying? Like, anything she can use to talk about herself and to put herself in the light. You're going to tell me that this is, I've never heard this story. But suddenly, this revelation in this book, there's people who are hounding her to such a degree that she's receiving threats on her actual cell phone, her private number. Please. So he's super angry, going from whining to being angry. And the therapist finally cuts in and says that, you know, his complaints, it sounds pretty rough. She admits, like, if that's really the world you're dealing with, wow, that's pretty hard. But then she says, after hearing you talk about all of this, I have to say that you just sound like you're stuck. And she tells him what we've all been saying since, like, literally day one. It would appear to me that you are still functioning as 12-year-old Harry. And that there is an Arrested Development situation here. Now, she didn't say Arrested Development. I don't think he'd know what that meant. But she does tell him, you're functioning as 12-year-old Harry. And you're viewing the world through that paradigm. So, of course, the world feels like a very difficult and scary place because you're trying to solve adult problems with a 12-year-old mind. He's horrified. I didn't like the sound of that. I felt a bit insulted. Calling me a child seems a bit rude. It's like, all right, well, you can't go to therapy and get help if you don't anticipate your personal feelings being trampled a little bit, right? Because that's kind of why you go. Because if you could solve your own problems, you wouldn't be there lying on that couch, right? You would not be there trying to have your brain sorted by a stranger if you could sort it on your own. But the therapist does say to him, she's like, look, you say you want the truth. You say you value the truth above all. Well, that's the truth. You are struggling and you're stuck. Okay. So I know I said at the beginning of this, I don't know how much help the therapist was. This was a helpful statement, but could she have said anything other? I mean, unless she was going to be completely and totally lax on the job. I mean, she had to say this at the very least. So, you know, they had gone over their allotted time. They had talked for 2 hours straight. It's time for him to leave. They set up another date to talk. He asks if he can hug her. Why wouldn't he want to hug Tiggy? They hug. And then he says that he goes out. His head is swimming. He wishes he could just like kind of walk up and down the street and just think about everything they talked about. But unfortunately, he can't do that without the Paps, you know, hounding him. So he's got to go home and just, and I'm like, but you have access to all of the palace grounds. Why don't you go walk there in peace and serenity? But then how am I going to complain? All right. Third session. He says that the therapist had actually met Tiggy before. Again, with the Tiggy references, which he thinks is an astounding coincidence. What a small world. And he says that they talk about how much he and Willie often turned women into surrogate moms, which they had done with Tiggy. And he says that it did make him feel better to have people in his life, like maternal figures, he has to admit. But what he also struggled with simultaneously was the guilt. Like, Mommy would be so hurt and so crushed. And he says that one of the things, he also reveals to his therapist at this time that one of the reasons he'd been reluctant to come to therapy is that, to his understanding, Mummy had also received therapists, but they hadn't been any help to her. In fact, he says that, to his understanding, some of the therapists had even exploited her and preyed upon her. And so he just didn't feel like therapists were really a safe option if you really needed help. Again, he makes statements, provides no evidence. He does not tell us anything as to why he came to that conclusion. What had happened to Diana with a therapist in which she had been preyed upon? I don't remember that. I mean, and admittedly, I'm not like, I don't know much about Diana. I've read like 2 books. But I don't remember anything happening in which she was exploited and preyed upon by numerous therapists. People, tell me in the comments. Is there evidence, instances of this having happened to her? I don't recall that. Then he says this, and this is probably the truest thing he's ever said about his mother in this entire book. He says that he and his therapist talked about Mummy's parenting and how she could sometimes overmother and then disappear for stretches. It seemed an important discussion, but it also seemed disloyal, and he felt exceedingly guilty about saying that out loud. Thank God he's finally saying it out loud. I think we all noticed that was going on. And also, it seems like when she would be around, like overmother, definitely. But also, it doesn't ever feel to me like when she was with the boys that she was functioning as a mother. Like, it was always like real big sistery stuff. Or like a fun babysitter. But I don't feel like she knew how to be a mom at all. Like, I don't think she possessed the ability to shape and mold the boys' destiny in any positive, meaningful, adult and grown-up way. Well, and we'll talk about an example of that later. But I mean, there's a difference between a parent having fun with their kids. For sure, have fun with your kids, by all means. But it seems to me that Diana did a lot of, complaining, like sharing things with her boys that she didn't need to share with them. A lot of like not asking, like not calling up the best in them, but sort of encouraging some of their like worst traits. If they wanted to be rebellious, telling that, like encouraging rebellion, encouraging rule breaking. You know what I mean? Like, it just seems like she struggled to really be in that role of mother, and when it wasn't fun, she would dip out. Anyway, then they talk about how he goes on this super long jag about how nobody in the public understands what it is to be a prince. Well, fault us for that. I mean, why would we know? Why would we know what it's like? But he goes on and on about how nobody understands it, and it's all because they've been watching too much Disney and they think it's all a fairy tale, but it actually isn't. He is a human being. Must he recall the time when he sat there getting his HIV test and noticed his blood was red? He's just like you. He's got red blood, even if you think it's blue. Actually, it's red. And he goes on this long stretch about how there had been a very famous intellectual who had written an essay on the royal family. And there was a section in there, though he does not quote it, so I don't know how accurate this is. There's no quotation marks here. But I think the summary of it is this. He says that the essayist wrote, "Our current royal family doesn't have the difficulties in breeding that pandas do, but pandas and royal persons alike are expensive to conserve and ill-adapted to any modern environment. But aren't they interesting? Aren't they nice to look at?" So he'd been really offended because he said, people were being taught not to think about the royal family as human beings, and that they were no more interesting than an exotic zoo animal. And so he said, was it any wonder that they were being destroyed like they were in the press, because nobody thought of him as a human being, and now that Meghan is tied to him, no one's going to think of her as a human being either. He says that on the one hand, he did feel like it had been an astute observation, because he says that he did feel as though he lived in a zoo. But he says that by the same token, he knew that as a soldier, turning people into animals or into non-people is the first step in mistreating them and in destroying them. And if a celebrated intellectual could dismiss him as an animal, what hope for the man or woman on the street? So basically, all the stupid people in the world won't be able to put two and two together and figure out that he's a human being if this celebrated intellectual somehow couldn't figure that out. So even in that, what an elitist statement. Like, he's literally just said, we can't dehumanize people because all those idiots out there won't be able to figure out that I'm a human. It's like, we can't dehumanize people. Let me dehumanize all of England. Okay. That's a perfect Harryism. But I will say this. If that is truly what you believed, and as far as he's able to conceive of his existence, if he truly believed that he had been reduced to nothing more than an exotic zoo animal, and if he really believed that the world saw him as a non-human, what a frightening place that would be. I can see feeling panicky if you felt like the whole world looked at you as a disposable object as soon as they get tired of the glitz, But I think the thing here that is so sad is that we know that his perspective is just completely and totally askew from reality. Everything in this book so far has just been lies on lies on lies, exaggerations, twisting of reality, my truth matters more than the facts. And so for him to come at us with this, if this whole book had been sanity and clarity and, the ringing of truth, then for him to come and say this, I would have so much more empathy for what he's saying here. But the problem is that this is just more made up garbage, Now, that's not to say that he can't have one or two things that are true in all the mess. So I do think that there is some truth to what he's saying in that we do enjoy, as a culture, objectifying famous people because, I don't know, maybe for some, it's maybe our way of getting back at them for having more than we do. I don't know. But regardless, there are far more people who enjoy the royal family and respect the royal family and respect the institution of the royal family that I don't understand why he doesn't play more into that. Like, you could always be distracted by your detractors, but why would you when you have so many more positives than negatives, But I mean, it is human nature. You can hear 10 good things and one bad thing and you'll believe the bad instead of the 10 good things. I get that, but that's a choice, right? So when it comes to intrusive thoughts, an intrusive thought can come into your head, and sometimes, that's just going to enter into your head. But you have the power over that second thought, right? So a bad thought comes into your head, everybody hates me. Second thought should say, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. What about all these other things that have happened that are good and right? You know what I'm saying? But Harry doesn't seem to believe he has power over the second thought. And that's his ultimate problem. Anyway, then we go on to some more of this rewriting the narrative, right? So that's all this section is. Rewrite the narrative. He says that he and the psychiatrist talked about his past drug use. He says, do you think I have an addictive personality? But he actually doesn't think he has one. He wants her to validate what a success he's been in handling his drug use. Because he writes, do you think I have an addictive personality? More accurately, what I wanted to know was, if I did have an addictive personality, where would I be right now? Hard to say. Hypotheticals, says the therapist. But she asked if I'd used drugs. Oh, yeah. I told her some wild stories. And she says, well, I am rather surprised that you're not a drug addict. And if there was one thing to which I did seem undeniably addicted, however, it was the press. So the therapist says, okay, well, you're not a drug addict, but you definitely seem like you don't know how to turn off this addiction to the news. And she says that, his constant reading of it and raging of it is obviously a compulsion. And he laughs and he's like, true, but I mean, that's not shit. And she laughs. They are. But nothing is resolved, right? She doesn't steer him away from this obvious compulsion. He's like, yeah, I know, it's a real problem. I'm not going to stop, so don't try. And I just don't see what the use of this therapist is. But That's Rich right over there with him wanting a pat on the back about how, look at you handling your massive drug habit. Who says he's not a drug addict? That's my question. Anyway, the next section, he goes in for therapy number 4. And this whole section is him recalling, it's like he's watching a film reel, and it's all these memories of him and Mummy and Willie and all of this. And it's just like one episode after another of him finally, for the first time, having these wonderful memories of his mother. And remember, he says he couldn't have, he hadn't been able to remember anything. And now he was having these really vivid, bright memories, thousands rushing in at him at a time. I don't know what this therapist did, but part of what she did was to bring sense memory into the whole thing. This guy and his mom's perfume, you guys, I can't even. Because of course we already know all the stories about how Megan wore his mother's perfume. Now he's never mentioned that, but he does say that his therapist urged him to get a bottle of Mummy's favorite perfume. He says he'd asked, he notes to us that he'd reached out to Mummy's sister to ask for the name of the perfume. He could have just asked Megan. And he says it was Van Cleef and Arpels. And that at the start of the session, he would lift the lid, take a deep sniff, and it was like taking a tab of LSD. Here come the memories. If only it was that easy. He says that, a lot of the things he remembered were him and Mummy and Willie just having a lot of fun. Them going into her room at breakfast time and sitting on the waterbed, and them jumping up and down, screaming and laughing and rolling around, eating breakfast in the bed. He remembers when she invited them to go have a chat with Christy Turlington, Claudia Schiffer, and Cindy Crawford. What a confusing time that was for him, especially at the, onset of puberty. He talks about how much he remembered kissing her soft neck and smelling her perfume and laying in bed with her. Anyway, so he goes on and on and on. But one of the things that I think is interesting, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that a lot of the memories that he has of Mummy are of her basically encouraging him to 2 things. Break the rules, and the press is your deadly enemy, right? So you can see that he internalized those things. And if we are to believe that Harry really struggled with intellectual prowess and maybe just wasn't like the sharpest crayon in the box, it would seem that he was all the more susceptible to the suggestions about life from his mother. So what she told him, he believed, and I think he's going to take it to the grave. One of the memories he has is of Mummy stuffing sweets into his socks. When he'd go off to school to Ludgrove, he wasn't allowed to bring any outside sweets because they provided tablefuls of candy, so you didn't need to bring your own candy. But anyway, he says that he remembers one day at Ludgrove, Mummy stuffing sweets into his socks. Outside sweets were forbidden, so Mummy was flouting school rules, giggling as she did so, which made me love her even more. I remembered both of us laughing as we buried the sweets deep in the sock and me squealing, "Oh, Mummy, you're so naughty!" And I remember the brand of those sweets, Opal Fruits, aka Starbursts. But she's got such an immaturity about her, right? Like all of his memories involve her giggling as she breaks the rules. And I feel like to become closer to her, he has felt in this journey away from the royal family that it was the royal family who didn't protect her. It's their fault that she's dead. And in her honor, he is going to wreck every rule that they've ever established. And then he has another flash of a memory. And this one I thought was just unbelievably emotionally abusive and also sort of physically abusive. He says that he remembers going to tennis lessons in the car. And he says that he remembers Mummy driving and Willie and he were in the back. He says that without warning, she trod on the accelerator and they went rocketing ahead up narrow streets, blasting through red lights, whipping around corners. He said Willie and he were strapped into their seats so they couldn't look out of the back window. but they had a sense of what was chasing them. Paps on motorbikes and mopeds. Are they going to kill us, Mummy? Are we going to die? Mummy, wearing big sunglasses, peered into the mirrors. After 15 minutes and several near smashes, Mummy slammed on the brakes, pulled over, jumped out, and walked toward the Paps. Leave us alone, for God's sake. I'm with my children. Can't you leave us alone? Trembling, pink-cheeked, she got back in the car, slammed the door, rolled up the windows, leaned her head on the steering wheel, and wept, while the Paps kept clicking and clicking. I remembered the tears falling from her big sunglasses, and I remembered Willie looking frozen like a statue. And I remember the Paps just firing and firing and firing. And I remembered feeling such hatred for them, and such deep and eternal love for everyone in that car. Can you imagine, as a young child, experiencing that? Your mother driving like a maniac through the streets, being pursued by what you thought was the absolute enemy, her getting out, doing battle with them, getting in the car, seeing her weep. Like, the whole thing is so completely inappropriate for a mother to have let her children live through that. And for what? And for what? I don't understand why she would do that to them. I don't understand why she wouldn't protect them from that reality if it was a reality. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I also am like, didn't she have any bodyguards or anything at this time? I'm not sure what her security system was like after she left, after she got a divorce, but it would seem to me that there would have been somebody there to protect her. I mean, what in the world? Like, this whole scene is just so, it's just so emotionally abusive to those kids. And physically abusive when you consider the way she was driving. And so I just think, how could Harry not have had this impression of life stamped on his brain indelibly? I just don't see how he could have gotten past this. If this is the way if your mother had led you to believe your whole life that the Paps were monsters, and then she ends up dying at the hands, arguably Harry is choosing to see the world, or just choosing to see that accident as the Paps' fault. But it would appear that she had given him evidence his whole life to believe that that could be a final conclusion. So I can hardly blame him. If this was how his mother taught him to look at the world, well, no wonder he's had a hard time. His next memory is of he and Willie and Mummy. They're on Necker Island, and all of the three of them are sitting on this cliff in this little hut. And then beneath them, there came a boat of photographers looking for them. Well, they'd been playing with water balloons earlier, Willie and Harry and Mummy, and so she quickly rigged up a catapult, divided the balloons among them, and then all three of them began to rain down the water balloons on the photographers. He writes that the sound of her laughter that day had been lost to him for years, and that finally it came back to him loud and clear, and that he cried tears of joy with remembering that day, and for the first time being able to remember her laughter. Again, I just can't decide if what she's being is fun or if she's being irresponsible as a mother. Because if you don't want photographers in your life, why are you giving them the photo of you throwing water balloons with your kids at them? It seems like she's just playing with fire all the time and then crying when she gets burned. Okay, so finally, we're done with the therapy session.